Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading Adam of the Road, and today I'm going to begin Adam's song. Well, Adam has hit the road again, and it's winter time now because it's around Christmas, and no, it's just after Christmas. And he is headed back to St. Albans, where Dame Malkin lives, because they think that Nick, who ran away from Jenkin, is going back to Dame Malkin. Meanwhile, Roger is in Wales with the Lord Delisle's. Adam's song. Iron lines still soon gathers rust, a stagnant pool is slimy. The harp unplucked is thick with rust. Most things not used grow slimy or grimy. The highway is the minstrel's home. He's working when he's playing. He's never lost if far he roam. He wanders when he's staying. I've gathered rust and dust too long, I need the wind and rain. I'll tell my tale and sing my song, out on the road again. Adam sang aloud as he stepped out on the road leading west from St. Albans. Hoarfrost silvered every twig and holly leaf in the thicket beside the road, and when the sun suddenly came out, the whole world shone and glittered like the fairy country inlay of Sir Orfeo. In the frozen ruts, thin layers of white ice broke under his feet with a tinkling sound. Overhead, great companies of rooks careered about in the sky, cawing and calling. It was nearly a week since Adam had left Delisle House. The bailiff and his wife had let him go without protest. It was easy to see that they had not been overpleased to be saddled with the care of the minstrel's son. The porter, on the other hand, had given him a penny and a packet of food and some careful directions about finding Roger. Stay at St. Albans School, he said, or go on to Ludlow, or come back here. Don't do any more seesawing back and forth from village to village, and try to land on your feet instead of your head. Agnes, curiously enough, had been more annoyed at his departure. She had scowled and pouted and said crossly that she didn't see why he cared so much about a dog. Matthew had walked part way with him the first day and seemed depressed when he said goodbye. I don't suppose you'll come back, he said, even after you get Nick? I don't suppose I will, Adam had answered. He liked Matthew, but he did not want to go back to Delisle House without Roger. Idling about the great empty house when the Delisles were away was no life for a minstrel. His place was on the road. He'd spent 3 days at St. Albans with Dame Malkin, and now he was on his way to Oxford, whither Perkins had gone with Nick. Yes, Nick was here, the dame had said, sitting hunched into a stool beside her fire and beaming up at Adam with deep, wrinkled, frosty blue eyes. I heard a scratching at the door outside and a whining, and when I went to open it, there he was with a broken leash trailing. He was thin as a twig, and his ears were full of mud and burrs, but by my faith he was happy. He jumped all over me, crying out for joy. Then he ran sniffing all over the house looking for you. Where is he now? Adam had cried. The dame looked miserable. I couldn't keep him. It's winter time and there is little food. I gave him my dinner that day, and how his sides bulged out after he ate it. So Perkins took him with him. He was off to Oxford begging his way. He said he could as well beg for two as one. He's keeping him for you. He said you'd come to Oxford to see him. Adam stayed 3 days at St. Albans because Dame Malkin could not bear to let him go. He got his meals at the Abbey guest house, but he slept in the cottage beside the fire. And in the long evenings, he told his old friend of his adventures. Oh, it's better than any minstrel's romance, she would sigh. Eh, lad, no wonder you're taller and have a thinner line to your chin. The masters at St. Albans School welcomed him more affectionately than he ever imagined they would, and once again he sang the Latin hymns with the choir at evensong. He marveled as he looked at the schoolboys how young they were, and he remembered with amazement that less than a year ago he himself had been as young as that. Now he was off for Oxford to find Perkin and get Nick again. Among all the scholars at the university, surely there would be some who liked minstrelsy and were not too poor to pay for it. He would stay there till spring, and then he would go on to Ludlow to meet Roger. His heart was filled with a deep content to be out on the road once more. He sang over the song that he'd made about it. A road, how clearly he remembered Roger saying it, was a kind of sacred place. If only he had his harp, he thought, and if only his shoes were not so thin. Dame Malkin had exclaimed over them. "Well, you'll never get to Oxford on those soles," she cried. "Country people wear wooden clogs to save their shoes. Couldn't you do that? I've an old pair you can have." "Oh, I couldn't walk miles in wooden clogs," objected Adam. "They'd break my feet." "These will last. They've got to." She'd given him some rags to pad with, but they were still uncomfortably thin on the hard, frozen ruts, and chilly too. Now that his attention had been called to them, he kept examining them anxiously at intervals to see if the holes got any larger. He thought they did. Now I'm going to pause a minute here so that we can see the map of where he has been and where he is going. Okay, so he started out here at St. Alban's, and then he went down this road all the way down here to Winchester. Then he had to go all the way back up, and he was back here at St. Alban's, but now he's headed off in a different direction. He's going to be heading over here toward Oxford, which is where Perkin is with Nick. Never having been to Oxford, he did not know just how to get there. Dame Malkin told him to be sure to go to Yulme, where Perkin's father lived, and no doubt he would help Adam on his way. She showed him the road to Waterford, which was sure to be the first stage of the journey. He came to Watford by noon and offered to tell the tale of King Horn at the inn in return for his dinner. Unfortunately, his memory failed him and he got stuck in the middle of it. The words that Roger used to say would not come, and worse still, he could not remember what happened well enough to tell it in his own words. Somebody laughed as he stood, red-faced and shamed, and several others, ignoring Adam altogether, began to talk about the weather. It was Candlemas Day, February 2nd, and the sun was shining. We call our February 2nd Groundhog's Day. If Candlemas Day be fair and bright, winter will have another flight. They use the same kind of expression and feeling about if the sun shines on February 2nd, then we're going to have more winter. Quoted a burly Longfellow in a thick fur-lined mantle, but if it be dark with clouds and rain, winter is gone and will not come again. And again, it's just like what we say for Groundhog's Day. He himself looked as if he were well fed and warmly dressed enough not to care if winter stayed forever, but everyone else was pinched and thin and pale. Adam knew better than to try to regain attention by competing with the conversation. He contributed to it instead. "Si sol splendiscat Maria purificant," he recited the Latin version of the old saw. "Major erat glacis post festum quam fut ante." The Latin startled the room into momentary silence, and Adam seized his chance. "I can sing, lordlings," he said. Without waiting for permission, he sang the song he'd made, and after that, "Winter awakens all my care." They liked the second one better. Then he told them news of St. Alban's, how the hares and rabbits had eaten the bark off an apple tree in Master John's garden all the way around the trunk, as high up as they could reach, and the tree would surely die. But how Harry the miller had now not gotten his oats in yet, but his old ewe had twin lambs 3 weeks ago. How the first pair of partridges had been seen in the wood near St. Stephen's Church the day that Adam got there. So those are apparently all signs of spring. "Oh, spring is on the way," said the burly man, "though it comes slowly. Here, Sir Innkeeper, give this boy his dinner and I will pay. What signs of spring do we have when it's still very wintry out?" Well, sometimes we can see the daffodils poking their heads up through the snow. Sometimes we can see the buds getting fat on trees. Also, the days are growing longer, and that's usually a good sign that spring is on its way. When Adam was ready to go, the innkeeper told him to follow the river Colne to Rickmansworth and give him a message to take to his brother, the smith there. So the minstrel not only sings and entertains, he is the news. He tells, what is happening in the world, but apparently he's also asked to deliver messages. "Tell my brother the baby is a girl," he said. "We're naming her Cecilia. The christening will be after matins next Sunday. Tell him to be sure to come." Adam spent that night with the blacksmith of Rickmansworth, who was immensely pleased with the news about the baby. "That's the first girl born in the family in 99 years, he said. The smith was a man of substance in Rickmansworth. He was a freeholder and paid rent for his smithy and his holding of 4 acres instead of doing work for the lord of the manor. So he's not owned by the lord of the manor. He pays rent. So if he wants to, he can quit and leave town and go someplace else. Whereas somebody who belongs to the Lord doesn't have those choices. Beside the money payment, he had to give the Lord 100 horseshoes a year, 50 with nails and 50 without. And he had to shoe the steward's hackney whenever it needed it at a penny for 4 shoes. But that was far better than having to drop his own work just when he was busiest and go plowing or reaping for the Lord. He was busy now sharpening plowshares and coulters for the spring plowing, and Adam perched on the windowsill and shouted to him above the din of the anvil as he worked. "I wish I could get 2 shoes for a halfpenny," shrilled Adam. "Would you like them nailed on?" roared back the smith, and Adam had to admit that he would not. That night it snowed. The next morning the smith's eldest son put Adam on the way to Amersham. The snow had drifted thick on the road, but on the fields it lay thin, giving them a dappled effect, white where the little hollows were filled, and purply brown where the humps were bare. It was easier to walk on the fields than in the road, but even so, before the day was half gone, Adam's big toe had come through his right shoe. When he came to a river and stopped to get a drink, he saw where little creatures had been before him. Rabbit footprints were there with the 4 feet together and the hind feet in line like a Y. And there were 2, the deep pointed tracks of birds, partridges he supposed, and smaller tracks that might be thrushes. There was no sun today, and the wind was sharp. He was glad when he came into a beech wood where the trees, bright green with moss, broke the wind but let light through. Under bushes where the snow had not penetrated, the fallen leaves still kept their deep gold color, so that the wood not only felt warmer than the open fields, but looked warmer too. From Hamersham, Adam passed on over the hills to Chipping Wycombe, which he was lucky enough to strike on a market day. He was tired out when he got there, and his big toe had come through his left shoe. But he found a welcome in the house of an apothecary who was in high good humor because he had had a successful day. The next day it rained, and the next. The third day was gray and heavy with dark clouds lumbering across the sky, covering swiftly any patches of watery blue that might show for a little while. The road was so deep in mud and so steep and so slippery that Adam could not get any farther than Fingist that day. He was as tired at the end of it as if he had tramped a dozen miles instead of 6.5. A cotter let him sleep in his hay barn, which was warm and fragrant. In the morning, Adam put hay in his shoes to cover up the holes. but it did not make them any more comfortable. From Finglas to Watlington, the road went past the Bishop of Lincoln's palace and climbed high up over the ridge of the Chilterns, where it crossed the ancient Roman Icknield Way and plunged deeply down again on the other side. It went through thick woods and sometimes all but disappeared in a tangle of bushes and saplings. Scarcely anyone was out that day, and Adam felt lonely and sometimes even a little frightened as he struggled up the steep places, over rocks, around muddy pools that seemed to have no bottom. In that inn, Watlington was a steward at the Abbey of B. He who spent his life, poor man, traveling from one manor to another of the Abbey's vast possessions, holding court, settling suits. In the last 2 weeks, he said wearily, he had covered 150 miles and held courts in a dozen different manors. He had several men with him, and they all looked at Adam in surprise when he stepped forward in his shabby brown mantle, with his muddy toes sticking out of his shoes, and offered to entertain them with tales of love and adventure. At first the steward, who was an important man as well as a tired one, and had troublesome problems on his mind, waved Adam away impatiently, but then he called him back and told him he might try. Adam considered telling the tale of Havelock, which he was sure he would not forget, but decided the steward, who spoke French with a French accent, would not care for such a very English story. He was afraid to attempt the lay of Sir Orfeo without his harp, and so he sang songs instead. Something made him choose first a lullaby that his mother used to sing to him years ago. Lullaby, Lullaby, mine liking, my dear son, my sweeting, Lullaby, dear heart, my own son, my darling. Afterward, because the steward was connected with an abbey, he sang the Latin hymn, Stabat Mater. It was wise, for the steward's head ached with weariness, and Adam's voice, so fresh and clear and soaring, carried him away far beyond the untidy little inn and the thought of tomorrow's traveling. When Adam stopped, the room was silent. Then the steward thanked him gravely and asked him why he was alone and where he was going. After Adam told his story, the abbot's steward said, "If, when you get to Oxford, my son, you should decide that you would like to stay there and study, go to see my friend, the warden of Merton College. Tell him I sent you, and that I think he could be of help to you, and you perhaps to him." He gave Adam 5 pennies, and Adam had supper and a share of bed that night, and 3 pennies left over. He spent the next morning trying to buy a pair of shoes in Watlington for 3 pence. He thought perhaps someone might have a pair that was worn but still sound, which he did not need. But the only shoes he could find were so big that he walked out of them the first step. So he had to set out to Ulme in shoes with no soles at all. Soon the worn uppers flapped so irritatingly that he took them off and went on in his torn hose. When these too wore through, he limped on over the cold, wet ruts in his bare feet. By mid-afternoon, the winter day began to draw in. Between the high, windswept fields, the road stretched muddy and rutted toward bare purple woods. Here and there, a swollen brook flooding the road reflected the cold, cherry-colored light of the setting sun. Shadows came out of the hedges, as if driven out by the rising wind. Adam felt small and lost as he trudged along under the enormous sky. He thought of the little creatures that shared his edge of the world with him, the mice, the rabbits, the partridges, and felt sorry for them in the wind and cold. At last a valley opened up before him. He saw a thin twist of blue smoke rising up over the tops of trees and heard, faint on the wind, the sound of church bells. So that chapter was all about his journey. And I think he's maybe here at Hamersham. So he still has a long way to go before he gets to Oxford. But meanwhile, the next chapter, and we don't have that many more pages, Adam helps a plowman. That's one thing I like about Adam, is he's never afraid to help others. And I also am happy that people have been helping him along the way too. Anyway, that's all for today. Bye-bye.